So if we consider a scenario, James, where a child is stopped and arrested on suspicion of being concerned in the supply of Class A drugs, and we think those drugs are concealed internally, take the child to hospital, X-ray, confirm that there are drugs there. We need those drugs, obviously, to pass through the system. If we are not dealing with the safeguarding element of that child at that time, whilst we're waiting for the child to sort of release the drugs, if we call it that, then we are firstly during that time we are eating into a detention clock under police procedures, so 24 hours maximum. If it's night time, then obviously the child would need a rest break as well. So time is quite precious. But the point I was going to make is that if we take 50 wraps of heroin off a child and then we haven't got a safeguarding plan and we return that child when they're released from custody to their home address, we've probably enhanced their risk, because that heroin belongs to somebody else who's expecting to raise significant profit from it. And we, through our actions, could be putting that child at even greater risk. And furthermore, we could be putting the family at risk. So to just think that we'll deal with the safeguarding tomorrow just is not going to be successful, and actually it's not tenable in a lot of scenarios. As I said earlier, it's County Line's a very complex situation, and this is one of those. If you're taking commodity off a child, what can we do to keep that child safe now?
What would you say to those that might say, don't take the commodity off the child?
Well, the involvement in county lines by anybody, but specifically by children, is incredibly dangerous. So that child, even with the drugs, is hugely in the way of harm. Mm-hmm. We see a significant amount of weapon carry. We know nationally that county lines drive serious youth violence. Some of the weapons that we seize, of which there are approximately 250 to 300 a year that my team takes, are terrifying. Swords, zombie knives, we've even encountered several viable firearms. So we need to remove the child from the county line's business, and taking drugs from them is the first step in that. But then, of course, as I said, you've got to get that safeguarding part right for when the child is released from custody.
So we've talked about that joint working and that joint investigation. What's your expectation of a gold standard investigation into a child's suspected exploitation?
Well, interestingly, in all of our cases where we've secured charges for Modern Slavery Act offences, we haven't had a victim. Clearly we have had a victim, because we've the children that we've interacted with and arrested as a first step, and then made enquiries around their activities, normally by means of mobile phone data, have led us to people that are exploiting often several children. But of course, they don't perceive themselves as victims. So when you think about how the criminal justice system is designed to work, so you have a victim that makes an allegation, you have a perpetrator or a suspect, and all of the information is shared in the body of the court, and a jury, if it's a serious offence, will make a decision. With our human trafficking charges, we don't have anyone standing up there and saying that individual exploited me, because they don't see it as such. So to make a compelling case is possibly a little more difficult. I mean, some may argue that it could be easier, because sometimes your witnesses, whilst telling the truth, aren't quite as compelling as others. which means that you can end up with, from a police perspective, a perverse outcome at court. But in terms of the gold standard, we need to analyse phones, we need to overlay that data with everything else we know. We need to look at travel patterns. We need to understand the scale and scope of the offending. We obviously need to identify those who are exploiting. That others, ideally, we want to understand how the recruitment process works, etc. But I built a dedicated team to do just that. So they are dedicated in securing and investigating human trafficking offences. And that has been a great success for us because we need to get upstream, as we would call it, in an investigation. We need to get those further up the food chain and bring them to justice, because that is how you make an impact. That is how you will stop children being an attractive commodity for them. Interesting, and I don't want to become too optimistic, but we've started to see in the last 6-9 months several young people who are just 18 but have never been in trouble with the police being arrested for county lines offences by my team. Now, I'm hopeful that is because people understand the lengths that we will go to in conducting a really thorough investigation in terms of human trafficking, modern slavery, and we will lay those charges on every occasion when it's at all possible.
So you're observing perhaps older young people as opposed to the young children that we've seen traditionally?
Well, if you have an 18-year-old that I would argue is still being exploited, but is quite adamant that they're not being exploited and they're not being coerced and they're involved in criminality willingly, it makes it very, very difficult to lay charges for human trafficking, which of course are very, very serious offences and should and do carry significant jail sentences. So it would make sense for those that are involved in organised criminality, running county lines, to recruit a slightly older individual, because it's very unlikely that we'd be able to apply additional charges and thereby additional prison tariffs.
Unless that person was to say, I'm a victim.
Absolutely, but that happens infrequently.
Yeah. And this is probably as an aside, just thinking through my understanding of the modern slavery legislation is it's written in exactly that way, that if you're an adult, 18 plus, that essentially the state doesn't intervene unless you make a complaint.
Absolutely. It's quite binary in that children, despite claiming that they're willing participants, it's irrelevant within the legislation. Adults, it's total flip of that, total reverse of that. So if 18-year-olds are recruited and exploited, then it would, as I say, reduce the prospect of any modern slavery offences.
You mentioned earlier supporting officers or observing officers being more alert to trauma and being much more alert to safeguarding from the off. How has that happened?
That's a very good question, and I'm not sure I can give you an adequate answer. I think I recruited the team. None of them were known to me. I was extremely lucky in the first line supervisors that I recruited, who have all driven this agenda very strongly. They were clearly committed, energetic, but they have instilled that empathy, really, and compassion in their staff. They've dealt with serious organised criminals and dealt with them extremely robustly. But their default setting is identifying victims who are involved in county lines. I think I've assisted it a little with some of the training that I've provided to ensure that it's always at the forefront of our mind. But I don't underestimate the influence that you and Amanda and others have had in that daily interaction, because it's well, I don't know of a scenario in policing elsewhere in the UK where social workers are trained social workers are an absolutely key component of that team and are seen as such. And of course, because you assist me with it, but we operate a safeguarding roster to support the officers that are out on the ground, so they can get lifetime advice about how best to deal with a child. Now, that isn't common in policing. That isn't something that takes place elsewhere. It isn't something that took place in the British Transport Police before you and others were recruited. But just having that dialogue, or even the opportunity of that dialogue every day, can't help but make them look beyond what is in front of them and how somebody is presenting. And I've already said I'm extremely proud of how they do go about those interactions with children.
It's an interesting conversation, actually, where sometimes people can respond to officers where they're saying, well, I think this child is the victim of exploitation or the victim of modern slavery, human trafficking. And someone might say, but you've arrested them. Well, they're also a suspect in terms of the offence, but they're both. So we believe that potentially they've come to our attention because they are involved in an offence, but we also believe by virtue of that they potentially are the victim of another offence. And what I observe across the country is that can be quite confusing for other agencies who aren't, or other forces that aren't at the or in the position that you and your teams are.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I'll talk about a specific scenario when we're talking about the ethics of making arrests, really. So one of my teams arrested a child, a 15-year-old. The risks to him and his family were significant. So he was arrested, he was interviewed, his phones were seized so that we could progress an investigation, ideally into human trafficking offences. But after the interview and upon his release from custody, my sergeant took him home. The strategy meeting had agreed that the family needed to be moved that night, and they were accommodated within a travel lodge. And the sergeant from that team bought them a meal. So the arresting officer has gone from 9 hours earlier arresting this individual to then paying out of their own money to make sure that the family are fed, whilst also making sure that we can hopefully identify his exploiters, making sure that the safeguarding strategy is in place, and then, as I said, showing concern for the family as well. Again, and that's not an isolated incident. That's the sort of thing that they do. But again, that's attitude. That's them being respectful. That's them understanding the factors that get young people involved into county lines.
And is that also that scenario that you've just given? Because at that critical time, there is no one else.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So in this context, what do you think is needed next for policing?
I think we need to, across policing, obviously I've had the privilege of overseeing a dedicated team that are really passionate about the responsibilities they hold. But I think vulnerability in all its guises can become a little mundane for your routine officers if they don't have that outlook or don't understand the factors that sit behind that vulnerability. So that when police perform at its worst, it's normally because it hasn't recognised risk around some form of vulnerability, whether that's mental health, whether that's domestic violence, or whether that's individuals involved in county lines. It's about recognising that vulnerability. So I think we need to make sure within policing that we're consistently looking to improve, so the training's right, the understanding is improved, and our response it then becomes better commensurately. I think, and this probably is a slightly controversial, but I think when poor safeguarding has taken place, and I'm talking in a police context now, I think there need to be ramifications. I think we need to understand what we did poorly and how we should improve. And we've evolved. Things change most quickly in police when there's something that becomes nationally recognised as a poor event. If you take the terrible Manchester bombings as an example, obviously national inquiry, all sorts of activity within UK policing now underway to ensure or to do our very best that can never happen again. And of course this force is affected by that. And that kind of painful and sort of widespread lesson, it's really important for us. Certainly in my career, when I've seen what I've considered to be a poor or sloppy intervention with somebody that needed a better service, I've addressed it. But am I confident that happens every time across this organisation? I'd like to think yes, but I wouldn't want to bet highly on it. So that understanding those ramifications is absolutely key. I think that we need to look at the progress my team has made. I'm talking with a specific BTP focus now, and look at what we've learned over the 5 years that we've been active, because we are certainly purveyors of national good practice now. I'd like to think we were very good when we started, but we've just improved, and it's been evolution really. It's not been big stick or right, we need to rip the rule book up and do something dramatically different. We started with an ambition. That ambition hasn't changed. Our strategic intent hasn't changed. But it's about that evaluation of the distance between where we are today and where we started, and pulling the key learning from that and making making sure that others are aware of that, sharing that learning with other policing organisations. I think there's lots of good things that have come out of our county lines efforts, and I think that we can help others understand how to deal with young people involved in county lines.
I think that's why I wanted to have this conversation with you, because I think that there's something about capturing what has been learnt and that evolution or that process that's taken place, because certainly what I'm asked to support with is different to 4 years ago. And I would argue that it's much more effective, it's much more streamlined, people are much clearer around what it is that they are needing to do as a minimum, as opposed to in addition. So I think that part of this discussion is amplifying your voice to be able to recognise what will help in other contexts or in other agencies to be able to drive this type of change.
We've really been blessed with the resources that have worked within the County Lines Task Force, in that they are driven, they are committed, as I say, they show great compassion, but they enjoy the work that much that our resource churn has been absolutely minimal. And what that has meant is that you've had 5 years of building expertise. So that expertise sits within that team. So whenever we take on a new starter, they're surrounded by experts, which is so healthy. And again, if those, if my team members then go on to other parts of the organisation, that learning that they've gained over 5 years, which effectively is a sixth of their career, so it's a significant chunk of time, that will permeate throughout the organisation. So I think it's incumbent on me to draw that learning out and make sure that it's available for others.
One of the things that you also noted there is around the cultural shift, I think, and certainly for the officers that work within your units, there's an openness and I observe more of a safety to share information and to be clear about what can be shared and for what purpose. And often there's a hesitancy about what can we share, what can't we share. And in the context of safeguarding, inevitably, whenever there is a review or an incident where we do learn from, we're often come back to very similar recommendations about improved information sharing, better working together. And I think that what we are talking about here are some of the ways in which we can overcome those through that relationships, through that building of a shared culture around what it is that we need to be focused on by way of outcome, and how do we then navigate that from a position where we can understand one another's agendas, where we can understand the purpose of police, the purpose of social work, the purpose of third sector organisations. And what we've been able to do, or what you're describing, is how we bring those into how we draw that into a shared focus.
I think we need to recognise a very simple point in that our relationship with that child is different. So that point of impact with policing is probably the most negative part of that journey. We're trying to make it more positive, but of course there comes a point where the child won't want to engage with the police, and possibly right from the start throughout that engagement, is unhappy with that. And the example I'd provide is that I read very carefully Rescue and Response's strategic assessment every year, because of course that's a different relationship with the child, but they are the children that we see. And some of the intelligence or information that's provided within that strategic assessment, we simply wouldn't get access to because of the way that our relationship with that child would work. And of course, because we're fulfilling our statutory obligations, they're different to how a third sector organisation can deal with the child. So we need that sort of full picture from everyone pulling together. We do certainly need to have shared understanding, shared ambition, shared vision, and shared responsibility around risks and the identification of risks. I think that's really important.
I think one of the things is, I absolutely agree with you. And I think when I'm considering, I think your officers and the rescue and response that you're talking about, the social work teams often, they're able to go one step beyond or one step before that, where they're actually considering what is it that's what are the needs or what are the unmet needs that really are driving the presenting risk and vulnerabilities, and then who within that system needs to do each specific task, so that it's clear what you were saying, that this is the role for a police officer in this system, this is the role for the social worker, and this is the role for the rescue and response team or another agency, and that actually we work to make sure that we minimise any gaps between that.
So yeah, the officers will come at that situation thinking, how can we stop this child being physically hurt in the very near future?
And that's what I observe. And initially the answer was, we put them there and they can't move and therefore they're safe. And in many ways they're right, because physically that's the scenario. But of course, what we know is that it's much more complex than that. And that's the growth, I think, that I've observed. But also that there's merit in what those officers are saying, that actually we shouldn't negate the fact that what they're identifying and the intelligence and information they hold, and based on their own professional expertise, what they're highlighting is that there is a danger to that child that we must recognise and we must respond robustly to. And that's, I think, where you're saying that actually in order to do that, what we really need to be doing from the very beginning is coming round the table, metaphorically or not, and saying, this is the strategy then for us to take forward that investigation and for us to jointly safeguard.
Absolutely. And we've said throughout this conversation, relationships are absolutely critical. You know, those personal relationships that you build with partners, they're the key to success. That's why, you know, things like the MASH is often very successful, because you've got that face-to-face, different agencies within the same location. So, you know, that's something that I think we all need to strive towards, is getting strong personal, professional relationships.
And I think, as you're talking, it's certainly something. I mean, the work of Future Voices, predominantly, that's the bread and butter of doing that for the individual teams around children, all the way through to strategic safeguarding partnerships. But there's something around, how do we facilitate that? How do you facilitate those discussions? How do you bring people along so that they're able to maintain openness to difference where it doesn't feel threatening? And then what we observe is that people are able to achieve much greater responses that ultimately we hope will impact children positively. So from your perspective, Gareth, what do you believe that police need from partners?
As a police leader, I need to understand what success looks like for other organisations, and then find some form of shared priorities, but then be in a position to demonstrate success. So it's clear that what is in it for them is being achieved, to build that ongoing commitment. So I think that's important. Where policing is traditionally poor is that feedback loop, and I think that is a really important thing to establish right at the start of any collaboration or collective effort, how you're going to communicate what you've done, how you've done it, and what the success is or what the outcomes look like.
Gareth Williams, thank you very much.
Thank you.